Hello everyone, my name is Anna Chaban, and I am the president of SUSTA, the Federation of Ukrainian Student Organizations of America, a coalition of Ukrainian students promoting and providing resources for Ukrainian student organizations in their higher education institutions. Welcome to our new podcast, which will consist of Ukrainian youth interviewing older family members to understand how they preserve their Ukrainian heritage both at home and abroad during critical moments in Ukrainian history. For our very first episode, I will be reading a chapter that my grandmother Zenovia had written for the book Children of War, Lives and Fates, which was published in 2013 by the organization Protection of the Children of War. This chapter describes my grandmother's childhood experiences during World War II in the Lviv region. Zenovia Hrynah Chaban, born in 1940. My computer memory through the eyes of a war child, our generation, the so-called children of war, seemed to have emerged from some forgotten age, about to disappear. Sometimes my consciousness, as my granddaughter would say in modern terms, takes me to a website of memories. I was born in 1940, and, as they joked, I immediately became a Soviet, because after my birth, my mother was immediately presented with a ballot box. There were some elections, supposedly for the Soviet government. No one then expected that this government would prove itself so well. My parents had the misfortune to become children of World War I, and I, as if by inheritance, of World War II. What can a child remember from this period of life? But something does come to mind, like frames from a film, torn from the darkness of this existence. I remember my older brothers, because I am the youngest. Probably the stressful moments of life flash more vividly in my memory. Everything is burning around. My brothers are running, letting the cattle out of the barns. Bullets whistle from above. Mom is lying on the ground, covering me with herself, and I, a little hero, stubbornly want to see how the bullets kill. Someone threw a tin can at us. What happened next? I don't know. I must have been 4 years old. We burned more than once. Near our farm was the main highway to Lviv, along which military echelons moved. The war buzzed day and night. Behind us, the city of Brody bordered the Soviet Union. We were often kicked out of the house. After the battles, we returned home again and were glad that something had survived. Many people emerged from the fog of memory, residents of the surrounding settlements, fleeing from the front, settling with us, just as we do with them, depending on how the front moves. You can't write off those memories of the war on 7 skins. Almost everyone had their own terrible and most terrible thing, which is now hard to believe, how one person can endure and another can inflict such a terrible atrocity. Events from different seasons are remembered, difficult not only for a child. We live in cellars, like herrings in a barrel. There is a fire in the yard. They cook food. This especially made me feel warm and cozy, a kind of happiness in the evenings, when flashes fall, shadows run away from the fire. The war moves now forward, then backward, and we, like the day behind the sun, wander depending on the attack. I never wanted to leave the house, as if I felt that I would never find it again. And so I sit on a chest, a small box for household items, kick the chest with my foot, and shout that I won't go. My eldest brother, 17 years older than me, grabs me in his arms, because a German with a gun is standing above my head, with the barrel of it pointed at my temple, and I lean back and shake my legs, because I've had enough of wandering. My frames have no specific age sequence. Mist, rain. We stopped in the village of Dubie, a hut on a hill. Evening. A fire in the middle of the yard. They cook dinner in a large cauldron, dough and milk. All the children are seated around a ceramic pot. We have dinner, burning ourselves with the hot stuff, fighting each other on the foreheads with wooden spoons. We are again driving a cart through the fields at night. The potatoes have not been dug up. The horses are getting tangled in that potato bed. My 13-year-old brother is walking with us. My mother is with me in her arms on the cart on top of the haystacks. Above us, a flare of rockets, the whistle of bullets. My mother dozed off a little. The horses suddenly stopped, and it turned out that I was not in her arms. But this is no longer my memory. They rushed to search in the darkness, felt everything with their hands, turned back, until suddenly someone stumbled with their hand under the rear wheel. If the horse had accidentally stepped forward, I would not have written today's story. At that time, a rocket flared up, and this time it saved me. But now, my own debut in memory. We arrived in the village of Yanhelivka, not far from Ozhedov, after terrible bloody battles. It was an ordinary autumn day, a hut on a hill, a staircase to the bottom, below the outbuildings, and a barn and a manure pit. Everyone is bustling around a young woman. She gave birth prematurely and is bleeding. Everyone is worried about her life, and she also has a small child. Everyone is preoccupied. As someone a little older than the small child, I was handed a homemade wooden cart with a small, skinny girl in it. The child was screaming wildly, but I couldn't hold the cart in my hands, and it rolled into that manure pit. Luckily, someone responded to my screams, and everything turned out well. I remember my house as a picture of an idyllic childhood. I don't know how old I was, but it was a spring evening. My mother is collecting freshly washed laundry from the line, and in the meantime, taking advantage of the moment, I climb onto the windowsill, where there are a lot of flower pots. There's a bright strip of the moon on the cleanly washed floor. The house is new, built before the war, and I feel so good under the curtain between those flower pots. I pluck the hanging buds. It must have been the fuchsia that was blooming, standing so brightly before my eyes. And then suddenly my mother's hand pulled me out of the window with a light slap on the soft spot. But the resentment from the fact that I had not finished my massacre of my mother's greenhouse was greater than that slap, and my happiness was cut short. But as the youngest child, they didn't pay attention to every small thing. In 1943, my grandfather, my father's father, died. He was old, and I was little. My grandmother died young. They lived in the village of Lisovi, near Ponikva. In 1928, they sold the farm, took out a loan from the bank, and bought a plot of land from the owner with their partners. In the spring, our family moved to an open field and began to build. My parents and their two sons, 4-year-old Andrei and almost 1-year-old Yevhen, who was digging out all the splinters on the new building with his buttocks, began to live there. Grandfather Hrihori was building nearby with his 2 younger children, then my grandfather Yuri Kozak, with his married son Roman, both of whom fought in the Austrian War, like grandfather Hrihori. They sold their farm in the village of Dubye. Our distant relative, the head of the village of Ponikva, Mykola Datskiv, settled nearby. Grandfather Yurko was wounded at the front. Despite the fact that Austria lost Galicia, it paid pensions to its former soldiers, and he was able to help his children. And grandfather Hrihori Hrynah married off his son Ivan and gave away his daughter Yevhenia in marriage. He lived with his son's family. I remembered my grandfather's funeral well. He died at the age of 68. In the morning, I went to see him, as usual, but they didn't let me in. It was an August day. The sun was shining. I ran around naked. There was a coffin in the middle of the yard. My two older brothers, Andrei and Yevgeny, studied at the Brode Trade School. They gave private lessons to weaker students and learned to take photographs. It was a very profitable business at that time because they could pay for their studies and even help my father pay off loans for the farmland. So, at the funeral, they took a picture of their grandfather. But all these photos burned down along with the house later. I didn't understand anything yet and thought it was some kind of game, and I sang that they would bury my grandfather in a hole and I would look for him. Of course, they didn't take me to the cemetery. I understood all this later, much more deeply and emotionally. I learned about the death of my grandfather Yuri somewhere in 1944, and even my mother wasn't at his military funeral. Our families were in different evacuation centers. After the battle, the stubborn former soldier Yuri decided to go to find out if anything from their settlements had survived. A few days later, he was found shot and barefoot, or someone had taken new boots or had taken them off the dead man later. They buried him after the war in some kind of cartridge case. It's good that they found it, and there was a priest. Mom had already found the grave in the cemetery of her 76-year-old father, who was still quite healthy and could still live for some time. Grandma Teklia died in the fall of 1946, at the age of 73. I already remembered her well. She came to look after me when Grandpa Hrihori was gone and Mom was away somewhere. Grandma always made me my favorite treats, bread with grated garlic, or kuhutek, chopped onion with oil. Mom sent me to visit her when Grandma was already sick. Once I came to her when no one was in the house. She called me to her, took a candy from under her pillow, and sent me to look for someone in the field. But in fact, her daughter-in-law and children were not far away. They didn't respond to my call. They were already getting ready. When I returned, about an hour later, my grandmother was gone. They sent me to get my mother. My way to school lay along the cemetery, and I always stopped by my grandparents' graves to pray for them. We, war children, grew up faster. Another picture. I'm sitting in the attic of a broken house. Dad made some kind of canopy or scaffolding. Like on a balcony, I'm sitting under that roof in the hay under a feather bed, in front of me like a half-open terrace, where there was a kitchen, only an oven. Dad attached some kind of stove, put a canopy over the stove so that snow wouldn't fall there. Smoke comes out of the chimney. Life goes on. Mom cooks food. We all sleep in the hay in the attic so that I wouldn't climb out of the attic barefoot into the snow. The ladder was taken away. I pull my hand out from under the feather bed, catch snowflakes in a handful. Mom scolds me, but I'm so happy that I sing. We, post-war children, didn't understand peaceful life. Peace. It turns out that you can also adapt to poverty and war. I had no idea that there could be anything else, anything better. Now I understand why the population of eastern Ukraine, which experienced famine in 1932 to 1933, war, famine in 1946 to 1947, became so passive. If you think about it, children in Ukraine are going through the same ordeal 80 years later that my grandmother and her relatives experienced. A new generation of war children in the 21st century. Unfortunately, history is repeating itself. Families are hiding from shelling in basements. And if they have the opportunity, they must leave their homes, which they built for their family life. They always have to move from one place to another, not knowing when they will have to flee again, and whether they will be able to return home. This is an allegory such that my great-grandfather Mykola and great-grandmother Nastya, my grandmother's parents, lived through two wars, World War I and World War II, and now, my grandmother Zanya, who wrote this story before the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, survived World War II and is now living through another war. My brother Yevhen had already started working as a teacher in the village of Dubye. He got me a children's book of fairy tales by Ivan Franko, When the Beasts Were Still Talking. He had read these fairy tales to me even earlier, and I had already learned them by heart. Now you can read. At first, everyone laughs, but from laughter, people emerge. There's nothing more to do. I marked the stops with a red pencil and, playing, my education went on. I read. Dad made some kind of dwelling for himself on the fire from the remains of trench material. It's already paradise. At night, someone knocked on our door. We looked out the window. There was a whole army in the yard. Dad said there were about 50 people. They were escaped prisoners of war. Someone said you could trust Dad to feed them and show them a safe way. They were from the East. My parents gave what they could. Pre-war people were more sincere, kinder. They warmed and fed passers-by. The people who were waiting for liberation received prisons, deportations, and the destruction of their spiritual and national heritage. Bad news flew in like black crows. After graduating from law school at Lviv University, the son of our neighbor, Mykola Datskiv, Yaroslav, came home. 3 days later, he was taken away by the NKVD, convicted as a politically unreliable person, and sent to Siberia. His older brother, Nestor, was serving in the Soviet army at the time. He returned home in 1947. I remember he came to us in a cap with a star and a military jacket. I don't remember what he told us about his service then, but after some time he came back and told us that partisans, that's what we called UPA soldiers, knocked on their door at night, whom the NKVD called banyorami. They asked for food. Nestor suspected that they were behaving unusually. Obviously, they were medvedovtsi. It is worth noting that the Ukrainian partisans were supported, fed, and clothed by the entire population. I witnessed how women gathered in one house, baked bread for their boys. They protected the people from repressions. In 1946 to 1947, collective farmers from eastern Ukraine came, hungry, swollen people, those who remained after the famine of the 1932 to 1933 years. Later, they said that the post-war famine could still be survived because they went to Zapadnaya, albeit on the roofs of trains, from which they were sometimes pulled off with hooks. Some right of private ownership remained in western Ukraine. The house was not closed to the unfortunate swollen people with children. Mom always sent me to take something to eat for those people. Everything was infested with lice. On the way from Germany, horses were driven, and you could find a dead horse here. Dad would skin such horses, chop them up, and boil soap in a huge cauldron. It would harden. He would cut it into pieces with a thread and divide them among neighbors and relatives. Mom would often take the clothes off the collective farmers in the yard and boil them. By the way, the collective farmers warned people that they would do the same to you. Be careful. They fought back. Nothing happened. Meanwhile, my mother helped the poor, gave money to the sick. In the best of times, she baked loaves for weddings, pierced the girls' ears. We had a family living with us. I don't remember from which region. They were wonderful Ukrainians, good craftsmen. They helped my father to build a barn, but we were constantly taxed with huge taxes: milk, butter, eggs, meat, grain, loans, pork, and calf skins. My father warned my mother to give out less food, because we ourselves would not be able to hold out until the new harvest. And so it happened. I myself had already asked my mother for at least a slice of bread, but there was none. Every day, they raided everything with ramrods. You can't hide from yourself. Then came the experienced ones, who had learned to find everything in the East. If you pay the tax, they impose a higher one. If you don't pay it, they take you to Siberia. Mykola Datskiv couldn't pay, and the stress of those debts caused him to have a stroke. His son Nestor, who had returned from the army, and my father were taken for the taxes and tortured a lot to expose those who supported the Ukrainian rebels. Because Nestor didn't want to confess, he was tried and sent to Siberia. Dad said that Nestor was old and didn't know anything, so they beat him up and released him under supervision. He lay at home for a long time with broken ribs, so we had to feed him. We were waiting for the eviction. They took people away in the winter because they were in their homes and couldn't escape easily. At night, people's screams and children's crying could be heard. My parents took me to spend the night with people, so in case of something, I would stay among their children. 3 times they submitted lists for our eviction, but turned out that on the way those lists were taken away and we were warned to be careful. Our defenders already understood that they would not win and saved their last bullet for themselves. People were also taken to the village council for the night, and the fate of the collective farm was decided there. There was no one to defend anymore. People went to the collective farm. That also gave the collective farm his horse, his cart, all the farm equipment, and the newly built barn. You can't describe everything. Our history is written by the labor, blood, and sacrificed lives of the heart of the Ukrainian nation. We have nothing to be ashamed of or afraid of. We must all write our history together, because it is foreign to strangers. War will no longer improve the lives of children. Those who went to the heights of communism have already arrived and are buying people in elections with buckwheat. While they are still being sold, it is only a pity for their grandchildren and an extreme pity. Evil rogues lull our Ukraine, asleep and only in the flames. Let her, all plundered, wake again. My father, the son of my Baba Zenya, always told me that any good that you do will always come back to you, and likewise, any bad that you do will always come back to you. Even during difficult times, my great-grandparents and those within their community chose to help one another because they knew that it was the right thing to do. Unfortunately, many of those who fought for Ukraine's freedom had perished due to Russian aggression, and many of those who had survived were afraid to speak about their experience because of the desire to protect their loved ones. Yet, history is repeating itself, and there are those fighting for Ukrainian independence each day. Those of us who are alive today were given the chance by God to preserve our culture, language, faith, and stories. In this age of technological advancements, it is so easy to just click a button, hit record, say a couple of sentences, and publish your story onto the internet. We have time to scroll through and just like whatever posts or reels we like on Instagram and TikTok. In the same way, we can make the time to connect with those in our lives who have lived through the Holodomor and World War II. They have been challenged and tested, but they managed to come out and pass on their culture to their descendants so that we could call ourselves Ukrainians. The least we could do for them is to listen and learn from them. Connect with them while we still can. You don't have to write a whole novel or draft out a family tree in order to preserve your history. You can just have a conversation and record it. Keep the memory alive.